So just to give you a bit of background, there are a variety of verified, reliable, and sometimes not very reliable or verified types of welfare assessments or measures you can conduct on farm. So you can look at data on the actual animals themselves, and of course this can be on farm, but you can also collect useful data from the slaughter plant. You can collect data on the environment the birds are in or the different types of management practices. And in our welfare assessments they're often based or grouped around the five freedoms. And I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with these already, but for those who aren't, they're basically freedom from hunger and thirst, freedom from discomfort, freedom from pain, injury, or disease, freedom to express normal behavior, and freedom from distress. So we would have different assessment measures that would try to target or look at each of these kind of five freedoms in a lot of our protocols. Now, because there's a number of different protocols, they also differ in their complexity and they vary in the time that they take to actually complete. And at the end of completing one of these assessments, you might end up doing some slightly complicated mathematics to end up with a total assessment score for that farm slash flock. Or you might end up with measures that either need to fall within specific ranges or limits, or you might have aspects that are just purely pass or fail. So they can be quite diverse and complicated. Apologies, I now have to figure out how to switch my slides. There we go. Another aspect of these assessments is that they often require at least some training and some baseline knowledge of the species that you're doing the assessments on. So while I'm sure a lot of you could just walk onto farm and collect some of this data, some of the other data, so scoring systems or things that might be a bit more subjective, might require some training and collaboration with people who already know how to do the assessments to ensure that the data you're collecting is accurate. And in my talk, I'm certainly not going to be able to cover all possible poultry welfare assessment measures because we'd be here all day and you'd probably be bored senseless. So we'll focus on the key or kind of more common assessment measures that we'll use, and I'll look at both layers and broilers. And just to give you a few examples of the welfare assessments that are readily available, you have the Welfare Quality Scheme, which has assessment protocols for a variety of species. Again, you have a shore well. These tend to be a bit shorter on welfare assessments, but again, for a variety of species. There might be specific assessment protocols put out by various NGOs like the RSPCA. And for any of you that actually actively work with poultry, you might be part of a scheme that requires specific measures or assessments in terms of your own auditing and accreditation. So again, lots of options we can potentially choose from. So if we look at when we do these welfare assessments on farm, for our layers, it's often focused on the laying period. And this is, the longest period of the layers' lives, of their production lives. But there is increasing interest in looking at the rearing environment as well. So some assessments might ask for some questions about the rearing environment, or they might require some data to be collected in the rearing environment. Some might potentially include some information or ask some information about the hatchery, perhaps about transport, and they might also include some slaughter data as well. And if we look at our broilers, we tend to do our assessments at the time nearer when the birds are reaching their slaughter weight. And again, there might potentially be some data that we include from the hatchery. We might look at some transport data, but for broilers, we do often include slaughter data, so things like carcass rejects or downgrades. So something that Richard will go into more detail is that we can look at different types of measures. So we can have environmental measures, which are a type of resource measure. And these can be assessed using things like your shed dimensions or the layout of the shed. So you might even have a schematic that you can refer to without needing to actually go into the shed to collect some of this data. Or if you don't have that to hand, you can actually just go out into the shed with your measuring tape and actually take some measures about dimensions and layouts. And these type of assessment measures are relatively quick and easy to get. And they're of course often on the flock or the shed level. So just as an example, often the assessments will ask things like, do the birds have sufficient access to water? And this falls under our absence of thirst, 5 freedom. So you might look at things like the number of drinkers you've put in the shed and the number of birds that are populating a shed. And then you can calculate things like the number of birds per drinker Now, there might be some limits set on this by either legislation or by the scheme you're on, but it's making sure that it's falling within the set guidelines. And you can also look at shed dimensions and layouts because some measures or some schemes might have limits on the distance between drinkers. So, for example, some assessment protocols might say that the chickens shouldn't have to travel more than X meters to reach a drinker. So you go into the shed with your measuring tape and you see how far the drinkers are from each other and ensure that the birds don't need to travel more than this set limit to reach a drinker. And again, this is a flock measure. And while it's telling us about the availability of water, it's not necessarily telling us about the use of water or drinkers. So some assessment protocols you follow might actually have you look at behavior as well to confirm that even though the water's there, the birds are using it as you would expect. And of course, a lot of your production measures will also tell you that because if they're not drinking, they're not going to be eating and they're not going to be producing well. Another useful environmental measure that we can look at is litter quality. And it's related to a number of other factors. So it might be related to things like your environmental controls, so your ventilation, your temperature set limits. It can be associated with breast, hawk, and foot lesions. It can be related to shed management, so the amount of litter put in, the type of litter even sometimes affects its quality. And of course, different shed areas might have litter of different qualities. So, for example, if you're looking at litter near a drinker, it might have worse quality than litter that's elsewhere in the shed. And so that's why when we're assessing this, we need to measure litter quality for multiple locations in the shed. And depending on the protocol you're following, it generally recommends about 4 to 6 locations, but of course that does depend on your shed size and potentially on the other equipment in the shed. Because it's recommended that you also take measures near different resources. Like I mentioned, the drinkers, where the litter quality could be worse, maybe near feeders, near walls, if there's slatted areas, near those. So from this, you can get an average litter score for the shed. But you also get an idea of the variability of litter in your shed. So it could highlight areas that might need a bit more attention to keep them up to a better litter quality score. So then if we look at some ways we can measure things on the animals in our sheds. Now, most of our poultry facilities, I'm sure, have thousands or tens or even more than that of birds. So trying to do measures on every individual is just not possible or practical. So when we do our animal measures, these are often done on individual or subgroups of a population. Now, these animal measures do take more time to do than our resource-based measures. And another challenge is that we need to try to ensure that our subgroups is going to be an accurate or an appropriate representation of the population flock. So you don't want to inadvertently, say, catch only birds who maybe aren't moving as well. And conversely, you don't want to only get the birds who are moving really, really well, so they're able to be kind of herded or penned up more easily. So you do want to try to ensure that you got a variety of birds. And this is also why you're going to be doing any of your animal measures, usually in multiple locations in the shed. So if we just focus on broilers for a little bit, when we're looking at broiler welfare assessments on farm, we often assess things like walking ability. So we'll score their gait, how well they're walking. We'll do some measures on thermal comfort. So that might be based on things like, are the birds huddling together? Are they very spread out? Are they panting? We might look at their feathers. So plumage cleanliness. Are they clean and kind of looking like they're well preened feathers? Or are they dirty and there's actually litter clumping to them? We'll look at their hocks and their feet. Mortality is of interest as well. And of course, this is being recorded anyway, but it's useful, if possible, to know not just your total mortalities, but also reasons for mortality and how this breaks down. And we also get data from the slaughter plant, so any slaughter plant rejects or downgrades are usually included as well. And we do try to measure some behavior in most of our on-farm assessments, but because behavior observations can be really time-consuming, in order to get a really good representation of what the birds are doing over, say, a 24-hour period, we often try to kind of simplify these behavior measures. So we might just look at things like flightiness, how they're interacting with the environment, and perhaps even trying things like looking at their overall demeanor. And one of the ways to do this is using something called qualitative behavior assessment. And this is basically looking at the bird's overall, their behavior, their body posture, and rating the birds on a kind of subjective scale. So you might be asked things if you're doing qualitative behavior assessment, like ranking the birds on how comfortable they look, or how hot they look, or how stressed they look. And then based on this scale, you can get again an overall idea or score of how the flock is doing behaviorally. And of course, if you've got broilers that have access to a range, then we also assess range use and cover on the range as well. So when we're gait scoring, there are a variety of scales you can use. The main interest when we do the assessments does tend to be in the birds that are either struggling to walk or that really can't walk. And like I said, it's not practical to gait score all birds, but we do want to have a representative sample, because it's quite easy with gait score to perhaps miss birds who aren't able to walk well because they're off to the sides, they're not in your kind of walking path where you're trying to move birds. Or conversely, they might be easier to catch because when you walk towards them, they're less likely or less able to move. And when we do gait scoring, we often combine this with other measures as well that involve catching, handling of birds. So we're not double handling or double catching. We try to do all of our animal-based measures on the same kind of subsamples of birds, because it's quicker. And again, we don't want to stress the birds by penning them or catching them multiple times if we can avoid it. So gait score, unfortunately, is a measure that does require a fair bit of training to be reliable and repeatable in your scoring. It is a subjective measure, and that's one of its critiques, is that it is based on somebody's perception of the bird walking. So a number of assessment protocols might use fairly simplistic scales. So they, for example, might use a score 0 to 2 scale, where 0 are birds that, are walking fine. Even if they do have some walking abnormalities, you're not quite concerned. Whereas a score of 1 might be a bird that's still walking, but is limping or has a very large gait defect. And a score of 2 would just be birds that aren't walking at all. In my work, I tend to use more complex scoring systems, which would be often it's a score 0 to 5, so a 6-point scale. And it's useful because it does allow us to tease out the birds with different walking abilities. Because birds who aren't, say, scoring a 1 in our simplistic scale, some of them are probably still in pain. And we know this from research and their behavior and access to analgesics. However, it of course does take more training, a lot more practice to use a more complex scale. So it's something that can be useful, and I'll show you in a minute why I think it's useful. But certainly, from a practical standpoint, it is more difficult. So something to consider if perhaps you're interested in doing these assessments yourselves, whether it's worth looking at something that's a bit more complex, or if you at this point are more confident in just working with a simplistic scale. So if we're going to gate score the birds, we'll pen them in or we'll block them in with livestock boards or something. And we'll do this in multiple locations in the shed. Another kind of challenge with gate score is that there's a fair bit of variation between birds in gate scores. So within a flock, you can have birds, that score all aspects of your scale. So it means that you want a fairly good sample size of birds when you're scoring this to get a good representation of the flock. And it's often recommended that you catch about 4 to 6 groups of birds, and each group would have about 40 to 50 birds total. So if you look at even the lower end, that's 160 birds, but you could be gate scoring up to 300 birds total. And more is better because it helps decrease the variability in your sample. But of course, it's going to take more time. So again, these are trade-offs that need to be thought about and weighed up, and it might depend as well on how big your shed is and how many birds are in the flock, and your number could be based on that as well. And we are, of course, going to be individually handling all these birds. So again, we need to be careful when we're handling them, and when you pen them in, making sure that we're not injuring any birds as well. So when we're gate scoring, you're basically just picking the bird up from the penning, putting it on the ground, and then encouraging it to walk. Birds that have worse gate scores or that don't walk as well might need more encouragement to walk. So some birds you might just put them down and they're happy to walk away from you. Some you might have to walk towards, and some you might have to very strongly encourage. So I've been, walking behind birds, clapping, making noises, trying very vigorously to get them to move. And it can be a challenge as well. And certainly birds that aren't walking well, I'm not going to force them to walk if they're unable to walk. It's just getting enough of an idea to be able to make that assessment. And generally, you need to walk for it's around 10 paces. Some assessment protocols might require the birds need to walk for a certain number of meters, but you need to be confident in that gait score and that you're accurately seeing the way the bird is moving. So gait score can be really useful, and it's certainly something that we would consider a welfare concern for broilers, but it can certainly be one of the more challenging things to measure as well. Whoops, sorry, I've double clicked on that. So we record a gait score for each of our individual birds. And so then we are able to calculate the number of birds with each score, but then we can also calculate the proportion of birds with each score. And the proportion can be kind of a rough estimate of your proportion of the flock that may have these scores. And you can also just calculate your average gait score as well. And as I'm sure a lot of you know, lower is better. So you want lower average gait score ideally. And then I just wanted to talk a bit more about the larger score ranges that I often use, because I do think that they provide some information that's lost with more simplistic scoring. So in my 0 to 5 gait score, 0 is the best, 5's the worst. Anything we score to 4 or 5, these birds aren't walking. They can barely walk. They might be pulling themselves on their wings or their shanks, and they're not eating or drinking well. So these birds should just be culled right away when you're doing your gait scoring. And then we have these birds, which are in this scoring system is a 3. In our simplistic score, this would be a score 1. And these birds, their gait, we know it's associated with pain. We also know that they're changing their eating, drinking behavior because they're in pain and they're not walking as well. So they might not actually be as efficient producers either. And there's also some indicators that birds with this gait score have links to worse meat quality. So again, these are birds that if you have this more complex scale, you can say, okay, I would definitely like to try in future to decrease these birds because they're not being as efficient as I would like, and they're potentially going to lead to more downgrades as well, which we'd like to avoid. But then we also have the ability to break apart the 0, 1, and 2 in this scale, which would be a score 0 in a more simplistic scale. And if we have a lot of these score 2 birds, these birds also have some potential links to pain in their gait, so they are potentially a welfare concern. And as well, depending on when this assessment is done and the birds keep growing, we know that as they get larger, their gait scores are going to get worse, most likely. So you're also running the risk of these birds falling into your gait score 3 category before they get to slaughter, which again can have production implications as well. And I will say that some assessment schemes might actually require this more complex scoring system because they do want to see the breakdown, and they are particularly concerned about these gait score 2 birds as well as these ones that are higher ends. So I find this useful. It might not be practical necessarily to always do a larger gait score range, but it's, I think, certainly worthwhile, once you have people trained to do it, to occasionally do it just to get a bit more detailed information about the gait in your flock and how you can work to improve it. So something else we can do while we're gait scoring is look at our foot and our hock scores. And these scales are usually fairly simple. They tend to be either, is there a lesion? Yes, no. Is it absent? Is it maybe small, so it's less than a quarter of the, say, foot pad? Is it medium? Is it maybe up to half of the foot pad? Or is it large? Is it more than half the foot pad being covered in a lesion? And these are associated with prolonged contact with litter, so that means that they also potentially have associations with our gait score as well. Birds who are not able to walk as much spend more time sitting. So it could be a nice kind of verifier with your gait score so they can correlate with each other potentially. But they might not correlate as nicely with gait scores you want because they might actually indicate a litter management issue. Because there's also a relationship, of course, to litter quality. So you might have birds that are actually walking okay, But if you've got areas where your litter quality is quite poor, you could still have a large amount of lesions. And of course, lesions are associated with pain as well. So we can use the same birds as gait scoring, but with things like the hawk and foot scores, there doesn't tend to be as much variation. And of course, the scoring system is smaller as well. So most of the assessment protocols we use are happy for you to score fewer birds for this than you do with your gait score. Personally, I've already picked the birds. I've penned the birds already and picked them up for gait scoring. It takes, a couple seconds to check out their feet and hocks. So I would just tend to do them anyway. But certainly your protocols will be happy for the majority to have fewer birds. So, for example, the Welfare Quality Assurance Protocol is asking for 100 birds total from 6 shed locations, which is less, sometimes significantly less than your gate score birds. And we also try to look at behavior of the animals because this gives us a lot of information about their welfare and what they're doing actually in the environment. Like I said earlier, behavior can be quite complicated to measure and time consuming. So we do have some measures or tests that we use to try to simplify these. So with the broilers, this is often based on activity level, again, because lameness is a concern. So we'll look at whether the birds are active or not. And we also look at things like fearfulness, but we'll kind of make it more simplified and kind of rank the birds between calm and flighty. And we might include interactions with enrichments if provided. Part of this is because if we're going to make the effort and the expense to include enrichments, it's important that they're actually being used and that they're actually useful for the birds. So their mere provision kind of isn't enough. They actually have to be functional. So a lot of these behaviors are related to walking ability. And then again, that might also correlate with your skin lesions because if you're moving more and you're sitting less, your skin lesions shouldn't be as bad. And of course, being able to move is also related to abilities to perform normal behaviors and related to stress. Now, some of the schemes or the protocols that you might follow might actually ask for more detailed or very specific behaviors to be recorded. So, for example, some protocols ask you to go into the shed, stand in a location for 2 minutes, and record perhaps the incidence of all the behaviors that you see. So, number of birds using a drinker, number of birds using a feeder, number of birds standing, number of birds foraging, and then repeat this in a few locations. And this will give us a very basic idea of some behavior, and it will at least confirm that birds are performing these natural behaviors we want to see. But they are short enough and in few enough locations that they're not going to allow us to say, well, my birds, forage for 60% of the day based on these 2-minute, observations. They're kind of a check just to ensure that we are seeing the behaviors that we would expect to see of a certain type of animal. So if we're looking at activity, these are fairly easy to do because you walk through your shed as you would normally, which will tend to disturb some of the birds. And then you stop and you turn around and you look at the birds within about 3 meters behind you. And this is just a really simplistic score. Are they mainly active? So are more than 50% of them active? So say walking, foraging, moving about. Are they mainly inactive? So less than 50% of them are active. And are they mainly sitting after they're disturbed? So first of all, these birds weren't able to maintain standing for that long. They've already sat back down. And also, depending on where they are, you might have not much space for activity either. So there could be just limits, physical limits on the ability of the birds to move around. And of course, you'd repeat this in different locations or near different resources. So in this video, if this was on farm, this is at our research facility, but if I had been doing this on farm, I've disturbed the birds and I've now turned to look at them. I would say that they're mainly inactive. So less than 50% of them are doing something active. Most of them are either just standing still or sitting. We can also look at fearfulness, and again, fearfulness could be related to stress as well. And we can ask the birds how they feel by doing some tests like the human approach or human avoidance test. And this can be indicative of a good human-animal relationship. So you're going to have people, in your sheds daily, a few times daily, moving around the animals. And so we're looking to see if the animals have made a negative association with people. So are they fearful? Or do they have perhaps a neutral or even positive relationship with people? So it can also then just be a fear measure, how quickly or how many of them move away when you come near them. So these are, again, fairly simple behavioral tests that we can do. We'd approach a group of birds. Usually it's asked to be 3 birds or more. You squat down, wait a few seconds, and then you count the number of birds within arm's length. You don't try to touch them because that might scare them off, but how many birds could you most likely touch? And then you would again repeat this in multiple locations. One of the downsides of this, of course, is that we might just be measuring mobility of birds again, because birds that aren't walking well, even if they're fearful, the motivation to overcome, say, potential pain of walking is going to supersede the kind of fear of you. So we do have to, again, look at this and then look at our gait scores as well to see if we're actually, how well we're measuring fear in this instance. All right, so we're just going to switch to layers for a bit. And of course, a lot of your protocols will have similar measures for layers and broilers. So I'm going to try to mainly cover the ones that are maybe a bit more unique or perhaps more key to layers. So if we're assessing layers on farm, we'll usually look at feather cover. So do they have, bald patches or naked patches of skin or not? We'll look at their feet, again, for feet lesions, but also for swelling. You might hear it called bumblefoot. We'll look at their keel bone or their sternum, and we'll look for PEC wounds on them. We'll often look for the presence of red mite. And of course, we still want to look at mortalities and potential causes. And for laying hens, behaviors that we tend to be most interested in are related to pecking, so both aggressive and non-aggressive pecking. And we'll still look at things like fear as well. And with layers, depending on the system, we might look at their ability to achieve vertical movement, sometimes horizontal movement as well. But if it's a system that's, multi-tier or aviary, are the birds actually using that vertical space? Are they moving upwards? And of course, if they have range access, we want to assess range use, the ability of the birds to access the range, and the range vegetation and cover. And for our hens, we're also going to be interested in the numbers and types of nest boxes provided and the number and types of perches. But as I said, again, with the broilers, this doesn't actually tell you about their use. So we know they're available and we know how many birds, say, per nest box there is, but we also often then want to stick in some behavior to ensure that they are actually being used as, they're intended. So if we're looking at feather cover, depending on the assessment protocol you're following, it might ask you to only look at certain specific body parts, or it might ask you to look at a range of body parts. So the ones that we commonly would look at is looking at feather cover around the head, and that's because lack of feathers there is indicative of aggressive pecking. We'll often look at the neck, especially if we're in a cage system, because this is often where wear or abrasion of the feathers occurs. So you could have bald patches on the neck from the birds, say, sticking their heads out to feed out of the feeding trough. Most assessments will ask you to look at the back and the rump, and for bald patches there, because this indicates feather pecking. And as I'm sure a lot of you know, feather pecking can be a large problem for laying hens. And then we'll sometimes also look at the belly or the area under the tail. And, your high producing birds might not be really well feathered here anyway, but if they are getting really denuded there, that can indicate that you've got some vent pecking going on. And of course, that's not great for the birds, and it's also not going to be great for your production. So if we're assessing feather cover, you can pen or just catch birds in the barn systems. You can block them in with livestock boards as well if they're available. And again, you're going to want to repeat this in multiple shed locations. So one of the protocols recommends 10 birds each in 10 locations, so that would be 100 birds. It does sometimes get more difficult if you're in a cage system to decide which birds to sample from. So you need to make sure that you are looking at different rows of cages, different tiers of cages, as well as different locations. So, near the door, away from the door, near walls, near the middle. But because you've got so many cages and so many options, and you're only picking, say, 10 in this example, it's going to be hard to get a really representative cover of cages. As well, sometimes it can be difficult to catch cage hens. Now, you'll have some hens that are standing near the opening of the cage. They're going to be easy to catch, but then you are potentially biasing your sample to birds that are, there and easy to access. Whereas if there's a bird that's hiding behind other birds, or if you've got, a cage system that has a larger colony of hens in it, we've worked in systems that have had, 80 birds in a cage, and it's really difficult. You can't just randomly say, okay, I'm going to pick this bird who's back at the very far back, bit of the cage behind your drinkers. Really hard to get those birds. So there are kind of downsides to the sample you are selecting in the cages. And also, we do know that hens being removed from cages is one of the ways that they can get bone fractures. So you also need to be careful in handling the hens. So what we do when we can for cage hens is try to observe the hen from outside the cage and remotely score them. So you're not opening the cage, you're not disturbing the hens. Of course, you might miss some body parts if the hen isn't in a position where you can fully view, say its full back or its head even, or perhaps its belly area. And also, you're still going to be biased a bit to the hens that are closer to the front of the cage. You can, get, and maybe your eyesight's better than mine. I can't always see right to the back of the cages, depending on how big they are, and depending on the lux levels in the sheds. But you can at least get a more representative sample. Although then, I said the downside is you might miss some body parts for that hen. So in those cases, we might not collect data from all of the body parts. We might just say, okay, we're going to focus for this on our back and tail areas. And while we're doing our feather cover scoring, we also usually look at comb peck wounds as well. So this is another potential indicator of aggression. So not just feather loss from the head area, but also you can see wounds on the comb. And so ideally, you'd like to examine both sides of the comb and you just count the wounds. If they're healed over, you would ignore them. So it's just kind of fresh, or, there's still a scab present on the wounds. And then when we actually make a score for this, we do tend to then categorize them. So we've counted the numbers, but then we're going to categorize them into either none or a few, which is often, less than 3, and then a lot, which would be 3 or more. And again, we can do this remotely, and we can use the same birds that we feather cover score from. But again, we also then have the downside of depending on where the bird is, we might not be able to see both sides of the comb. And I should say we can remotely feather score and comb peck score birds in a barn system as well. And same downsides that the birds might move away, might be harder to see them. We often we often find it easier to pick up birds from a barn system, so we do tend to do those individually, whereas we're more likely to try to do things remotely in the cage birds because we don't want to be trying to remove birds or disturbing them from the cages. But it might depend on the protocol you're following, what they actually require as well. So another key assessment we look at for laying hens is their keel bones. And this is because palpating the keel bone can give us an indication of old or new fractures. They might result in keel deformities, so kind of bends to the keel, or they might have thickened or knobbly parts on them that could also be indicative of healed fractures. And we know that these are associated with pain, and that birds that have these more severe keel deformities, um, they don't move as much, they don't eat as much, and therefore they don't produce as much. Now, you might see some minor deformities, and these might actually be related to the perch design. So rather than the birds, fracturing their keel, and that's what's causing the deformity, you might get some kind of compression deformities from the birds sitting on the perch and the keel pressing into the perch. There's still a welfare risk there, but we're not quite as concerned about these as we are with the major deformities, which would be more indicative of old or new fractures. So if we're doing the keel bone assessments, again, we just tend to use the same birds that we've already penned or blocked off for our barn systems. And you would palpate the keel. So generally you have to pick up the bird, you hold them upside down by their legs, and you run your hand down their keel. And you want to see if it's straight or not, if there's any thickening or kind of knobbly areas. One of the challenges with keel bone assessment is that it does take a fair bit of training to become really good at it. So I've got a picture here. I've dissected a keel bone out of a hen um, that we had at our trial facility after we were doing some palpation training. And this is a deformed keel. It does have, a deviation in it, but it's not a huge deviation. And so it's more difficult for people who are newer or not trained to be able to feel that this isn't a correct keel, that there's an issue here. And there's, a lower correlation between your palpation assessment and then what you actually see when you dissect the birds for people who are newer or who haven't been trained at all. So training is really important for this measure to be useful. And of course, if the birds are in cages, in order to palpate the keel, we can't do this remotely. So we are going to need to remove birds from cages. And again, we have to be careful because we don't want to injure the birds. And as I said before too, we want to try to avoid only taking the birds that are near the front or really easy to catch. And of course, you'd repeat this in multiple shed locations or in multiple cages in different rows and tiers and so on. Um, but again, even though this is perhaps more difficult to assess than some of our other measures, most assessment protocols still only recommend you do this on the same number of birds that you've often done your other assessments on. Another useful thing is while you're palpating your keel bone, you can also use the keel bone assessment to assess body condition. And of course, birds with more prominent keels have worse body conditions. So if you've got a lot of birds with very prominent keels, it could indicate issues with feeding or nutrition. If you've got, just a few, it could potentially indicate specific issues with that bird, perhaps being bullied or kept away from some of the resources. And of course, if the birds aren't eating and drinking properly, they're not going to be your best producers either. And of course, we like to look at behavior as well, so we can do similar flightiness tests that we did with our broilers. But as I said earlier, for layers, we're quite interested in aggressive or injurious pecking. So we'll do kind of a similar thing with the broilers in that we'll walk through the birds or we'll disturb them and then wait till they settle and then watch them and record the number of aggressive or injurious pecks, maybe in 4 or 5 minutes. And then we'll do this in multiple locations. Something about pecking as well is that sometimes you might hear vocalizations of the victim being pecked instead of actually seeing the peck. So sometimes you can also record vocalizations as well as a proxy for pecking. Sometimes some of the protocols will just ask for whether a specific behavior has been present or absent while you're watching. So did I see the birds, say, for example, interact with the enrichment, like I have my birds in this video that was a nylon rope that the birds have unpacked, and it's now just a very messy looking thing, but they still are using it. So I could say, in this, yes, I've seen the birds interact with the enrichment. Okay, yes, I've seen the birds feed. Or you might actually be asked to look at proportions of birds doing behaviors. So instead of just a yes or no, do I see this behavior? You might be asked to count the birds. So I'm watching this group of birds for say 4 minutes, and I'll count the number of birds that I see preening, that I see foraging, that I see dust bathing, and so on. Um, of course, the more detailed behavior observations do take longer, but depending on the protocol you're following, they might be required as well. And of course, we can do our approach avoidance tests with the hens as well. And any hen that has outdoor access, we would also want to look at the range use. Now, sometimes we might go out and actually count the number of birds on the range. This isn't always the best representation because depending on the time of day or the weather, range use can change quite drastically. So we might also look at things like the wear of the ground or vegetation around as an indirect measure for range use as well. And we'll often look at things like both horizontal movement, especially if they're in cages. So can they walk from one end of the cage to the other without equipment? So maybe perches, for example, blocking them, or without other birds preventing them from getting to one side to the other. And we also, where practical, look at vertical movement, as I said before, the birds moving up in a system with multi-tiers. And we also want to just see if there's birds have ability to move away from each other, because this is important for birds who are trying to avoid aggression or avoid being pecked, that they should have the ability to move away and avoid another bird. without being impeded or stopped by equipment or other conspecifics. So just to talk about in general some of the challenges when we're doing these on-farm assessments, management and environment-based measures are certainly quicker to do. They're not telling us much about the animal experience. They're just kind of telling us what's there, and they're not telling us about the actual use of what's there. So we really need to also look at the animal-based measures as well to get a fuller picture of the animal's welfare. And some measures can be collected at the slaughter plant, as I said before, and that can be useful to do a kind of more randomized sampling. So instead of my going into a shed and going to one location looking at birds, I can stand in the slaughter plant, and as the birds go by me on the line, I can say, okay, I'm going to assess every third bird. So that's a much more randomized sample, and it's probably going to also allow me to do a larger sample than I could on farm. The downsides of this, though, is that it's post hoc. The birds are away now, they're dead, so it can't be used to actually improve conditions for that flock. Whereas if you're collecting data on farm on that flock, it can be fed back and things can be implemented immediately. Another challenge is just the variety of welfare assessment protocols available. So there's certainly not one that everybody is going to say is the best. There's some that might be better in terms of how thorough they are, but then fall short in terms of practicality. And again, like I said, depending on your schemes that you're part of or what's required for your audits, they might require certain measures that perhaps aren't even in the welfare assessment protocols. So there's kind of an absence of one good protocol that we're all following, that we're all happy with. As well, some of these assessments can be quite lengthy to complete. Some of them aren't. Some of them can be short, and you might spend, an hour at the farm doing them. But some of them, I've been on farm for like 6 to 8 hours doing welfare assessments for one shed. That's quite time consuming, lengthy. It's not necessarily practical, especially if you're doing it your own farm to kind of rate yourself and see how your production is going or ways you can improve. And of course, some of these measures require training, which also then takes more time. And of course, there's not always clear advice on how to choose your samples of birds. Some protocols will have kind of diagrams you can follow, but depending on the layout of your shed or if it's a cage system, it's going to be difficult from one person to another to make sure it's consistent. So if you're doing these yourselves, if you try to be consistent in your own sampling areas between your own assessments, that at least provides some repeatability. And some of our measures are on the flock level, some are on individuals, and of course both have advantages and disadvantages. Flock levels kind of give our average bird experience, which can be useful, but it doesn't give details on individuals, and it misses out on some perhaps important deviations or variation with your different scores. As I said at the beginning, they don't always cover all the life stages of the animals. Laying hens, we're focusing on production when they're laying. We're missing out on rearing for a lot of aspects. And really, with the cage birds, I think we don't have near as clear guidance as we do for the barn systems. And we're not considering necessarily the needs or the preferences of the animals. We're considering just the environment they're in and not necessarily what else could be done to improve them in some cases. One thing, a last kind of challenge I wanted to point out, because I think it is important, is that our assessment protocols are often measuring either the negative or the absence of a negative outcome, and the absence of a negative isn't necessarily a positive. So I think it would be useful if we also were able to incorporate more positive welfare measures needed. So not just saying that, well, my birds, don't have this bad thing happening and therefore they're happy. We can say, well, no, my birds are showing things that are indicative of positive welfare. Like in this video, we've got birds perching, we've got birds dust bathing. These are things that would be indicative of positive welfare. These are difficult to measure if you're on farm because they don't occur all the time, especially dust bathing. It's diurnal. So the birds might dust bathe all the time, but depending on when your assessment is, you might miss it completely. And I know we've worked with a bit and talked with people who are interested in doing automatic monitoring. So not just looking at locomotion in terms of how much the birds are moving, but what they're doing while they're moving. But it's still not there yet. And I imagine when it first comes out, it's going to be a bit costly as well. So in the future, hopefully we can get more automated measures of behaviors. And just to point out for yourselves that welfare assessments, while they might be necessary for auditing purposes, they can actually generate really useful data for yourselves. You might find some sheds have higher incidence of things than others, and you can then investigate why something might be occurring, maybe more feather pecking in one shed than another. Maybe you'll find that there's seasonal effects, and then in certain seasons you might need to, say, for example, top up litter more or up your ventilation. And you can also measure success of changes, and you can monitor to see how well you're doing. So if you are trying to improve things like your, say, hawk lesion scores, you can monitor them yourselves and not have to wait till when, an official assessment or audit is being done. And it can also just help, like decreasing mortality, decrease slaughter rejects, and of course, any birds that eats and dies and doesn't make it into the food supply chain is feed wastage as well. So it can help reduce that. So just briefly in summary, our management environmental indicators are easier to measure, but we definitely need to include animal-based measures. And the people doing assessments should be trained and consistent in scoring, especially if you're using multiple people. And I think it's really useful to agree sampling locations in advance. So if you can get schematics of a shed and agree in advance where you're going to be doing these, you can at least be consistent within yourselves. And our assessment outcomes can help us to improve bird welfare, but they can also help us to improve our flock management as well. So that's all for me. Thanks very much for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions if there's time. I didn't have a watch, so I have no idea how much I've droned on. I do like to talk about chickens, and I find it hard to shut up. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen so I can see you all better.